Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, Barbara.
Good afternoon. It's great to see so many of you here today. Welcome to our first Book Sandwiched In presentation for 2019. I'm Barbara Cook, co-chair with Amy Towery of the Book Sandwiched In series. And Amy is somewhere there, right in the front. We are very pleased today to be meeting here again at the Congregational Church. This lovely room seems to be especially suited to our program. There are cookies, coffee, cocoa, and teas at the counter and table to the side of the room. Please help yourselves if you haven't already, or get a little bit more. Memberships in the Friends of the Library are also available at the Friends table at the back of the room with Brad. Good news. You will not need to put away chairs today. This space will be used tomorrow for the Aging in Place program. Come at 10 o'clock to learn about Bampa's house. We're also doing surveys today, as many of you have already filled them in, as part of our planning for next year. So if you didn't have a chance to fill one in now, there are extras up at the table that you can get at the end of the program. We really appreciate your input. President Lee Mertson has asked me to remind you that the annual meeting of the Friends of the Library will take place today, immediately following the presentation. Please plan to stay for a short review of the year and also to vote on the budget. A minimum of 25 in attendance is required to conduct business, so please try and stay for those few minutes. Our speaker today is Leslie Danks Burke. She will review The Soul of America by Jon Meachum. A lawyer, public advocate, and the founder and president of Trailblazers PAC, Political Action Committee, Leslie is a familiar name in local politics. She has led workshops for groups of 10 to 75 people on the importance of local level civic engagement, and has also acted as a fundraiser to support candidates across 2 states. Leslie graduated from the University of Chicago Law School and practiced law for 12 years before turning to community advocacy full-time. She has served on a number of boards, including Planned Parenthood Advocates of New York, the Women's Bar Association of New York, her local library, and Tompkins Cortland Community College. In addition to her political activities, Leslie is a hockey mom and Girl Scouts leader and enjoys time spent outdoors with her family. Welcome, Leslie, as our first presenter of 2019.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Barbara, for that introduction. I appreciate it, and thank you very much for including me as your speaker at this inaugural Books Sandwiched In of 2019. And I'll confess to you that this is also my very first Books Sandwiched In at all. And so I appreciate you including me and inviting me. And I'm just curious, I hear that there are folks who come to this every single time. There are folks who only come when they like the book. There are folks for whom this is also their first time. Anyone who's also here for the first time like me, can you raise your hand? Okay, and then those of you who've been 90% of the time, can you raise your hand? So this is a reading community. This is impressive. And as a past member of my library board in Tompkins County, I'm really appreciative of libraries reaching out into communities and creating reading communities like this. So you all deserve to be commended. I appreciate it. So I'm going to speak about Jon Meachum's The Soul of America. Okay. Does that work? Can you all hear me? Shout out if you can't hear me, and I'll just get louder. So I'm going to speak about Jon Meachum's The Soul of America. And how many folks have read it by any chance? Parts of it? Read a review of it? Didn't read it but told someone that you did? President George Herbert Walker Bush that I took the time to watch again last night in preparation for coming to speak with you all today. And I really commend that to you as well. The sense that you receive from watching his words about President Bush Sr. is really some of the same sense that you get from reading his book. So I commend that to you as an opportunity to see more of what Jon Meachum is saying to all of us about the soul of America. The book takes you through the history of, in my words, the great presidents of our country, of the United States of America, and the great thinkers who occupied the White House and took the initiative while there to, in their ways, move the country forward along the path that they most thought was appropriate. And the book really grapples with the question about whether those occupants of the White House were reaching the soul of America, something that is innate and intrinsic in America, or whether they were imposing their view of where the America they believe in should be going. And the book begins very clearly by acknowledging that those occupants of the White House were white men, generally white men with wealth, and who came from wealth, and that perhaps that perspective influences their perspective on what the soul of America is. The book begins with a study of George Washington and then of Jackson, and then moves very fast into a conversation about Lincoln and what Lincoln was grappling with as he presided over the country during the greatest dispute that this country has ever seen, internally, the Civil War. And there's a quote that stands out to me that he pulls from Lincoln's writings, and I want to read this to you. And the introduction from Jon Meachum is, Lincoln was less certain about how to design and implement this plan of salvation. If all earthly power were given me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution, he said. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land. But a moment's reflection would convince me that whatever of high hope, as I think there may be in this, in the long run, its sudden execution is impossible. What then? Free them all and keep them among us as underlings? It is quite certain that this betters their condition. Is it quite certain that this betters their condition? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this. And if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of white people will not. A universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded. We cannot then make them equals. It does seem to me that the systems of gradual emancipation might be adopted, but for their tardiness in this, I will not undertake to judge our brethren of the South. And those are challenging ideas that Lincoln is grappling with. And to read those words puts you back into the context of the thinkers of the day, and the thinkers of the day who were looked to for their inspiration, who were heard, whose words were written down, were the white men thinkers. And the struggle that he's grappling with is whether to send the slaves back to Liberia, whether to free them and keep them as underlings, which in his view was the next alternative, or whether to free them and make them socially our equals, which, well, that's not an option. He discounts that right off the bat. So with that kernel of thought from the president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, who brought us through the Civil War, who fought valiantly against a economic structure that relied wholly on slavery. With that kernel of thought from that great president, it helps us understand that the divide that we have in our country goes way back and is one that we have been constantly seeking to overcome, and that it's a path, that it is not an either or. It's not going to be possible for us to change the face of America, to capture the soul of America in one action. Frederick Douglass spoke about Lincoln and says, "He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity in the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of this country. The race to which we belong were not the special objects of his consideration. Knowing this, I concede to you, my fellow white citizens, a preeminence in this worship at once full and supreme. First, midst, and last, you and yours were the objects of his deepest affection and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity." So Frederick Douglass understood this at the time. He understood this challenge, this duality that they were facing as a country, as a civilization, as two peoples, a black people and a white people at the time. He understood that Lincoln was fallible and that Lincoln didn't have it all figured out, but that he was the leader, and we had to look to the leader to help him be the best that he could be. And that's something that I think Jon Meachum is really pushing throughout the book. Do we look to our president? Do we look to this always has been a man who sits in the White House and is the leader of our country? Do we look to him as the source of our guidance, as the person who speaks to us about the path that we should take? Or do we look to the president as the person for whom we must provide guidance? Do we share the thoughts of our popular views to the president so that he can take that information and lead us accordingly? And that's a real tension throughout this book in Jon Meachum's perspective of the president and in his perspective of the soul of America that the president is constantly trying to grasp and trying to reach. Let me see what else I wanted to say. There's a couple of reviews that I printed about the book that I thought were interesting. One of them talks about the book as a timely and urgent appeal to remember our shared values. And as soon as I read that, I wondered to myself, are those shared values that we have, or are they values that we aspire to? So right off the bat, when you consider the soul of America, you have to ask yourself, is this a soul that we innately possess, or is it a soul that we're striving for? I'm curious, I'm seeing some nods from people who raised their hands when they said they'd read the book. You're nodding at me. Did you have something you wanted to say there? I've heard that this is supposed to be somewhat of a give and take.
I'm only going to say that my experience of history is that we deal with it over time, so we change over time, and our understanding, awareness, appreciation for our application of the lessons of history, all of that changes. It is never a constant.
I think that's what Jon Meachum is aiming for. I think that's true. And once I got about 3/4 of the way through the book, and I got more comfortable with that idea, that we are not expected, in Jon Meachum's view, to look to the president as the person who will lead us out of darkness into light, but actually as the person who is the leader of all of us and whom we should have an engaged conversation with. Then I became more comfortable with the idea of Jon Meachum's Soul of America. Yes?
You're saying he's the leader of all of us, but if you go back to Washington, women couldn't vote, blacks couldn't vote, American Indians couldn't vote. White men who didn't own land couldn't vote. Washington was elected by 40,000 votes, I think is what he got, and there were 2 million people in the United States. So it's only a minority that made Washington president, land-owning white men. So how can the rest back then declare, he is my president?
So I'm an attorney, I'm a lawyer, and I'm going to tell you that one of the things that I studied a lot in law school, and I will also say, are any lawyers in the room?
No, but I gotta say one thing about your school.
Yeah.
University of Chicago.
University of Chicago, yeah, I'm about to go into
Noted for where fun goes to die.
where fun goes to die. And they're proud of that, and that tells you something. In law school, so University of Chicago is a fairly conservative law school, as law schools go, and it is the birthplace of the Federalist Society. It is where departed Chief Justice Scalia really developed his academic views and his judicial philosophy, and then obviously he went on to the United States Supreme Court and was able to put that imprint onto a great deal of our constitutional law. And so one of the big discussion topics that we had at University of Chicago, and I'm sure at other law schools this conversation happens a lot as well, but the question is there an originalist intent to the Constitution? Are we intended to follow the exact words as they were understood in that day when they were set forth in the Constitution? Are we intended to follow that original intent? Or is the Constitution a living document that evolves over time? And I think that Jon Meachum's view would very much be that it's a living document. And that just as Jon Meachum calls on all of us to hold our presidents to a higher standard, to hold them to an ideal, to strive to reach an ideal of what the soul of America can be, so too is the Constitution meant to be a living document that becomes deeper and richer and fuller as we have greater experience to add to those words. And so that's a long way of answering your question there. And I think your question is, given that George Washington was elected by white landowning men over a certain age, does that mean that everything he stood for was wrong? Does that mean we have to discount all of it?
Doesn't mean that he's the president of all the people, or all the people are, you know, the majority
Could
of
he
the
have been the
because
president
of
of all the
social
people?
structure, a majority of people were left out
Right.
at that time.
So I think that what Jon Meachum is grappling with in this book is the idea that the soul of America is a popular soul, a populist soul. It's also a progressive soul. It is forward thinking, and it is constantly seeking to include more. And that as citizens, we are expected to hold our politicians accountable to that soul, and that we are not asking our politicians to stand for what they, to stand for the values of perhaps the small subset of people who put them into office, but instead stand for the values of the whole. And not act only in the interests of those who may have voted for them, but act in the interests of everyone.
Well, and then it behooves us.
That got a reaction. Yeah.
Well, and then it behooves us who may not have voted for him to make those opinions known for that very reason.
It behooves those of us who may not have voted for the president to make those opinions known and stand up and vocalize those things.
First Amendment.
Jim,
Yeah, I wish that was the case, but it isn't.
I'm so glad you spoke. Jim and I had this wonderful relationship where we got to be on WETM together for the last several months.
I served with I mean, you know that New York City is the bastion of Democrats. There are very few of the representatives that get elected in New York City have general election opponents. They all have primaries where the Democrats run against them. I actually had Democratic Assembly people from New York City that told me that if they got a complaint or a call from a Republican, they just did nothing about it. Because they didn't need their votes to get elected. And they just said, what do I care?
Yeah,
So could everybody,
not
could
what
everybody
I
hear?
just said. It means we should speak up. Yes, they
Okay,
don't
so-
have to listen.
I'm just telling you the way it is in some
So what
places.
Jim is saying, and I think it's a good point to get out there, I hope everyone was able to hear him. What he was saying is that he's had colleagues or acquaintances who served in elected office who have been very blunt, very brazen about the fact that when they get a phone call from a constituent who is of the political party that really doesn't carry any weight at all in their demographic, and in the example he's using is in New York City, a Republican voter, that voter's vote might not be able to turn the tide against a Democratic elected official, that elected official doesn't even take the call.
Well, they take the call, but they just don't do anything.
They don't do anything about it. They don't listen.
They-
And so is that what, is that what we should be doing? Is that how we should be proceeding? Is that what the majority rule means? Is that what it means when someone wins? That those views carry forward?
It's the old dilemma about what is representative government. Are you voting for the person, or are you voting for what they believe? What does it mean for one person to represent multiple attitudes, beliefs?
So just to, I'm gonna get back to you in just a second, but just to give you some data on this. As was mentioned, I'm the president of Trailblazers PAC, which supports candidates of any political party who are running for local level office, as long as they take a vocal stand, an active stand for clean government. And so we've done some research into how voters participate in elections. And what we learned was that in 2017, the outcome of elections at the local level in most places in New York was decided by approximately 3% of the population. So in New York City, where the primary, the Democratic primary, pretty much decides who's in office, those primary voters who come out and vote in the primary, who actually show up, they're who make the decision. For all the other voters who don't show up in the primary, not to mention all the voters who might show up in the general election, but the decision's already foregone because Democrats always win in that particular jurisdiction. So 3% of the people are making the voting decisions, the representative decisions, for the entire rest of the population. And that's in 2017.
That's for the whole state of New York?
That's true in New York City, in Democratic fashions. It's also true in rural communities where Republicans are the vast majority. And the Republican primary or the Republican county committee decision is the dominant decision, and the general election really hardly matters. So that's really interesting that 3% of the population is making the decision for the other 97% of the people. And that's in 2017. And if you compare that back to when George Washington was elected, and a very small minority of the population, the white landed gentlemen, were making the voting decisions for the rest of the population, it's actually pretty similar numerically. And so when you think about those numbers, you can wonder whether we have progressed, whether we actually do have a more populist approach to democracy, or whether we still have decisions held in a very small handful of people.
But the difference between those two examples is that the current situation is due to apathy and voluntary non-participation. These people have a choice, a limited choice. You can't join a party right before the primary election in New York State, and I don't believe that's one of the recently enacted reforms. But there's a big difference.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I wonder what Frederick Douglass would say about that. I wonder if Frederick Douglass would say, yes, the right to vote was given to the black citizen, black man, after the Civil War, and it is that black man's choice whether he chooses to step up and participate in elections, or whether Frederick Douglass might point out that there are additional barriers that exist in 1879 that would prevent that black man who has the right to vote on paper from participating fully.
And there are still barriers today, and there's a lot of people across mostly other parts of the country that are trying to increase those barriers. But in New York State, at least, there's a big difference between recently, quote-unquote, liberated peoples back after the Civil War who had much less access to the rights that they were rightfully given, but much less access than even some of the worst states now in the United States.
True, true. Yes.
I think those folks from Washington's time, that their imprint has come down through the ages. Just look at the Electoral College. Popular vote versus Electoral College vote. The white folks out in Iowa got their fist right around that, decision making. I just wonder how much voice we really have.
and how much do we own?
Another very significant factor in all of this is called money.
Do you want to elaborate on
How long have you got?
that? Well, I've been working full-time on this for 3 years now, so at least 3 years.
I need to do a little thought organization of my thoughts here, but the influence of money in our voting practices is a little frightening. He or she who is elected is the one with the most money. Almost inevitably, that's how it works out. And I often have wondered, toyed with the idea that if we did a little better job of controlling the financing of our elections, like everybody has the same amount of money to run up, no matter what party, no matter who you are, what flavor you are, whatever. Would that level things out, and then would thinking be the dominant issue, rather than how much cash you can bring to the party? Just a thought.
Do you have a response to that?
I agree with what she's saying, but I see things as more basic. You were saying Meachum has this quandary about whether we're going with aspiring to our better nature versus just taking care of the nuts and bolts of things.
I'm sure that's exactly how it's
Okay,
written, but yeah, okay.
Okay.
But I think that is another vote.
But aspiring to better nature, as human beings, we like to judge and we like to punish. But you've got the Emancipation Proclamation, which is, okay, I won. He was being very generous and very kind. Never followed through on that. And we ended up paying for it 100 years later. But that would be, the Emancipation Proclamation would be aspiring to the better nature, and we don't seem to do that.
So I wonder, putting these two thoughts that you both raised together, I wonder if money corrupts, if money is a corrupting influence in our discourse, or whether it merely amplifies certain voices over another. Yeah.
I think often money goes to the person who money thinks will win. But the money is not what puts the person in office, but the person who is most likely to win is going to attract the money as a way to
Sort of
buy.
popularity begets more popularity.
And I'd like to add one other thing. This is a group of librarians. I just looked up one here. At the Library of Congress, they have one line that you can look at. 35,000 pieces of George Washington's papers, 20,000 of Abraham Lincoln's documents, and 1,000 of Frederick Douglass's documents that you can go online and examine.
They exist online? You don't have to go to the library?
Yeah,
That's
you can
tremendous.
look this all up and dig in and read everything that's in there. And those are the only three I bothered looking at here, but I imagine basically any president, I believe, before Franklin Roosevelt will be in the Library of Congress, and most of them, if they're not online now, they will be soon.
That's great, thank you. So I'd like to stick with this idea of money and wealth and the influence of money in our civic discourse. And I sort of cracked a joke about that. I have made it my career over the last several years to focus on money in politics. And what I have focused on and what my organization Trailblazers PAC focus on is money in local level races. Because if you just look at the value of local office holders to people's everyday lives, there tends to be many more touch points. Your local level office holders are who fill your potholes, they're who set your property taxes, they decide where your kids are gonna go to school. Those are not the people who are going to lead a nation into war against enslavement, right? And against a economic structure that disadvantages an entire population of people. Those decisions are made at the presidential level, but those sorts of wars don't happen very often, only once so far in our country's history. So I have made it my work to work really closely with local level officials. And one of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years is that influence of money in politics at the local level is actually exponentially greater than it is at the top, than it is in high levels. And here's just an example that I'll give you. In a Corning City Council race, for example, you can donate up to $1,000 in that race as an individual to a candidate for Corning City Council. And anyone can donate that, whether it is a person who lives in the district or lives outside of the district, right? Can donate $1,000. Well, in a given Corning City Council district, there's probably 450 voters, let's say. Or the race will be won by, about 450 voters. So the $1,000 that comes into that race is over $2 per voter. Now, if you were going to take that same number and apply it, for example, to a gubernatorial race, the race we just had for governor in 2018, and if the contribution limits were the same for a governor, then that would mean that someone who lives in South Dakota, outside of the District of New York State, could donate, the equivalent value would be $17 million to the person who's running for governor in New York State. So if contribution limits were commensurate for small races as for large races, you would have that substantial amount of money. Well, Governor Cuomo, who just won the governor's race in New York State, spent about $40 million total in that race. And that was extraordinary. That's a lot of money. But it wasn't $17 million from one donor. So when you look at the influence of money in politics, we don't think of $1,000 as being big, huge money in politics. But when it's the equivalent of $17 million in a gubernatorial race, it sort of puts it in context how much money we're talking about. And so when you get to that scale of wealth, when you look at that dramatic a difference, and I'm circling in a very large way back to your point, when you look at that scale, it is almost similar to the dramatic wealth disparity that we saw at the founding of our country between wealthy landowners and the people who worked those fields. It's almost that same scale. And so I wonder, as I read The Soul of America, and I read this call by Jon Meachum for all of us to find our better angels and to rise to that occasion and to hold our elected officials accountable to that higher standard. Jon Meachum leaves the book optimistically. He leaves the book with a sense that we can bridge these divides. We can overcome these challenges because we have overcome them in our past. The Civil War was won by the people who opposed enslavement. The American economy is no longer built on slavery. We came through the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. And those are optimistic moments to think about, that we have confronted these challenges in the past and we can do it again. But at the same time, we can't let that optimism tell us that it's easy. And that just because we've done it once before, we obviously will be able to do it again. In fact, every single one of us is called to work as hard as we possibly can in order to find those better angels, in order to find the soul of America, and in order to achieve and reach those higher standards. And so the reviews that I read of the Soul of America that ended on the note that Jon Meachum was saying, we can do this. We're going to be okay. We can get through these great struggles that we have. I think that's only half of what Jon Meachum was saying. I think the other half is, but we have to work. But we have to strive hard to find those better angels and put them into practice. And I think that's what he was saying in his eulogy of George Bush as well. That we can look back on George Herbert Walker Bush as a man who was, in Jon Meachum's words, perhaps the last great statesman, and that he brought a measure of civility and compassion to his political philosophy. His idea was compassionate conservatism. But that we can't abandon that, and we can't decide that that era is over with the death of George Bush, but instead that it's incumbent on each one of us to go out into the world and find that again and bring that light to the fore again. So I hope every one of you will take a moment to read this book, or even just a review of it, and think very hard about what our role as the voters in this representative democracy that we have is, and how engaged and how participatory we are all expected to be in political life. Whether it is something that happens because we've chosen representatives who have taken that on themselves as their work for all of us, and we can let that happen, or whether we are expected to be intrinsically engaged in it throughout every step of that process. And that tug and pull of populism, and how populist we're expected to be, how much each individual person is expected to participate in a representative democracy, that's a real tug and pull we're seeing at play, I think, in American culture right now.
The one thing I got from the book was the growth of the president in the office. Of course, Lincoln is the obvious one, but Lyndon Johnson, after Kennedy died.
Yes, and he talks about the night that Lyndon Johnson spent, the night that Kennedy died, and that he woke up. Okay, it says Lyndon Johnson couldn't sleep as Friday, November 22nd, 1963 turned into Saturday the 23rd, the new president of the United States. He had taken the oath of office some 8 hours before in Dallas in the wake of the assassination of his predecessor, John F. Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson wanted to move. Very frankly, Mr. Speaker, Johnson told House Speaker John McCormack of Massachusetts, I can't sit still, I've got to keep the government going. And that's how he entered into office, was this sense that we need to get it done, this work that John Kennedy had started and that is unfinished. We need to move. And then, throughout the chapter with Johnson, Johnson is constantly faced with the slowness of American civic change. that you can't just change it overnight. And that's something that Johnson, I think Jon Meachum is talking about, that he grapples with throughout his presidency, that as much as he passionately wants to move, he can't get it all done right now the way he wants to.
This past autumn, I read the book by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Why We Can't Wait. And it gives a great deal of insight into how much he felt there was a drive to face these problems because they're not going away. They're only going to get worse if we don't deal with them. And I think Johnson felt that. At some point, I think that made him more productive.
So let me see if I can find my other quote on that I'm suddenly thinking of. Okay, so that's really interesting that you bring up that book by Martin Luther King, because in this story of the relationship between Johnson and Martin Luther King, Johnson is the one who wants to move, who wants to push things forward, and Martin Luther King is the steady hand at the helm who recognizes that the long arc of history shifts slowly. Here's the quote. President Kennedy had left a proposed Civil Rights Act in the Congress. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 8-year-old daughter Yolanda was distraught on the afternoon of the assassination. "Oh, Daddy," she said, "now we will never get our freedom." King was reassuring. "Now don't you worry, baby," he said. "It's going to be all right." And I don't think he was just talking to his 8-year-old daughter. I don't think he was just trying to calm a child. I think he was speaking his truth, which is that this movement that we have started, the soul of America, which is about equality and about equity and about equal respect for all voices, that soul is too powerful to die with the death of one man, and that we are in this long arc and it will be all right. But nowhere in there does he say, it's going to be all right, so now we can sit back and let Johnson do it. No, he just keeps on working. He keeps on working. Yeah.
One more little thing to throw in the basket of money.
We're gonna go back to money, good.
When we're thinking about the long arc and our long-term goals and how we're going to accomplish it, we also have to remember the impact that money has on how our country runs. We talked about George Washington's day when you had the few landowners who were extremely wealthy and everybody else who did the work down there. If you look at our economic distribution around shortly after World War II, we were getting pretty close to a bell curve of wealth. That curve is shifting in this direction, so that now the vast bulk of our financial resources are in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Now it's down into the 1 and 2% and more than 95% of the wealth. And we have to factor that in and think about it. And when I talked about money, we've got to find a way. Now, we're not going to go rob those guys. But we've got to find a way to take that power out of the hands of the very wealthy.
One of the things that I regretted about this book is that I think it stops too early. It stops after, he runs a little bit further. He has a few comments on what happened in the 80s, but very little. He pretty much stops at Johnson. And I'm waiting now for the sequel to this. I hope that I hope that Jon Meachum writes a sequel so that we can understand what he thinks about what you're describing. Because you're right, there wasn't, if the soul of America is a passion for trending toward equality. And if we are all seeking that in whatever flawed ways we can, whether we are, by virtue of our circumstances, more knowledgeable about that, like Frederick Douglass, or less knowledgeable about that, like Abraham Lincoln, we're all striving for that. And if that arc had been continuing through Lyndon Johnson, then why did it stop? Or why have we shifted? And you're saying it's the money, and I think that's right. But I think there's more to it than that. Because I think that you don't know that it stopped.
I wouldn't agree that it stopped.
Okay, that's good. Push back at me on that.
Well, I just think maybe it's fewer people pushing that way, but I think there are definitely people that still want to go in that direction, so I wouldn't agree it stopped.
So there's fewer people now that want to go in that direction.
Or
but
maybe
it's-
fewer people who dare to be vocal, because it's so easily tamped down.
Okay, I think you're onto something, because I think that's right. I think it's more than money. I think there's a disinclination to participate in a way that we haven't seen. You talked about apathy, that we haven't seen in our country's greatest moments of crisis. We usually see a larger rise to action than I think we saw in, for example, the 80s and the 90s. But I'm gonna get to you. I think we're shifting again now. I think we are seeing a rise to action starting in around 2014. I don't think that it's just related to the 2016 presidential election. I saw a real resurgence of American participation in civic discourse starting around 2014. So that's another reason I want to see Jon Meachum's sequel. Maybe that's why he stopped it when he did, because he doesn't know what the trajectory is from 2014 through 2022 is yet. And I think that's going to be interesting. Yeah.
Money is power. And when you're in power, which we've seen, you like to codify things or make laws that are in your advantage. And what we've done, we use the word equity as those things are equal. But if I can pass laws and call them equitable, but they're to my advantage, that's what we've been doing. You know, with the social structure is such that you codify, you make the laws that you lawyers can have fun with. That so it's to our advantage because we're in power and we call it equity.
So I think you make a good point, and I hope you'll run for office someday. Yeah,
So does he talk about FDR in his book?
he does. Yeah.
And
He talks a lot about FDR, and he talks a lot about Teddy Roosevelt as well. And what he does with each of those, and I realize we're at the end of our time here, but throughout the book, each time he talks about one of the presidents, he really illuminates how that president's background as an affluent man of a race that allows him a certain measure of respect, is something that both enables that man to achieve his goals and also hinders him. And in the conversation about Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt was the populist progressive, right? He really pushed hard for equality of religion. Religion was particularly his concern. And there was a rise in Teddy Roosevelt's era of anti-Semitism that came through in the First World War and then obviously reemerged in the Second World War, but Teddy Roosevelt saw that on the horizon, and that was one of his passions. And yet he came from a very different demographic and was
Well,
able
he
to
was
speak.
the trust buster, I mean.
Exactly. So today, as we're looking at our own civic participation and our own choice about how to engage in democracy and how much to participate with our elected representatives, I think that Jon Meachum's admonition to all of us is to recognize that it's a conversation, that there isn't one way forward, that it's an ebb and flow of history, but that these kernels, this core of American values is not something that can be cast aside by any individual occupant of the White House, because it is, in every sense, the soul of all of us, and we can't be cast aside that way. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for thinking.